slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you
With the conversation we're going to have today, there's going to be a significant prescriptive intent. And the question of identity is it's a deeply sacred one. It's a deeply sacred one. And I hope that at the end of today, we leave here with a shared understanding of the concept of identity and how we can build an identity that lasts a long time. And that's why we're here today. To be frank with you, I believe that one of the easiest ways to outcompete most people in our generation is simply by having an identity, because it makes your life easier. You know, who are you? Who do you want to become? And as we alluded to, we do this little dance with our identities where when someone asks, who are you? Our default is to fall back to what I call identity proxies. So, for example, you probably say, oh, I'm a student at Unilag, and, you know, does your identity change every time you change years? Okay, you graduate tomorrow and that identity proxy expires and you get a job somewhere. So every time you change jobs, does your identity actually change? What if you get laid off? What if you start a business, you're the CEO of your company and you get kicked out of your company by the board? Who are you at that point? Who are you at that point where you're just another lost soul in the wilderness? And this is the bane of the identity question. We need to be able to define an identity that doesn't crumble when the external affairs of our lives change. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing these lectures. Someone asked me yesterday, why are you doing this? And I don't think I even liked the answer I gave to him about why. But it's clear that we need to talk. And we're starting with identity because it's the pivot, it's the fundamental pivot around which every other problem we experience as a generation revolves. And if we solve that problem and if we nip it in the bud, then a lot of other issues will just dissipate, from then on. So we'll start out today by trying to go a little bit into the root of the problem. Do we ever ask ourselves, why is there an identity crisis? Why is that something that exists? Is it a persistent, perpetual part of human existence? Does it tend to spring up every now and then? And the answer is yes. So there's proof for that, of course. There's historical proof for that. If you zoom out a little bit and take a look at the broad sweep of human civilization across time, one of the things you realize is that identity crises tend to spring up in the context of changing times and seasons. So what I mean by that is identity crises are the lagging effect of significant socio-technological developments. So when we see massive advancements in technology, in our sociological realities, then usually identity crises tend to follow. And there's historical proof, and I'm going to walk us through some of them. So in the 15th century, the Europeans discovered mathematics. They also discovered the ancient writings of ancient philosophers, or the translations to those writings, as a matter of fact, and they discovered the astrolabe of the Arabs. So the astrolabe is a small astronomical device. It's like a pocket watch, and back then it was used for timekeeping. It was used for maritime navigation and astronomy. And these discoveries led to the age of exploration and the Renaissance era, which some of us might be familiar with. And what happened in these eras, this age led to a fundamental questioning of long-held medieval beliefs. And it also led to the questioning of the centrality of the church for the first time ever in defining the identity and purpose of human beings. And as a result, we saw a significant mass identity crisis spring up in that time. In the 17th and the 18th century, the Dutch explored human anatomy. So Copernicus and Galileo founded astronomy as an epistemological field of study for the first time. And so for the first time too, ancient Philosophers, people like Thales of Miletus, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, they were studied properly for the first time. And world exploration was in full force at this time due to significant advancements in maritime and military technology. So these intellectual shifts that happened at the time led to significant calls for democracy, for liberty, for equality. And at the time, it sparked revolutionary movements across the world, but most importantly, the American and the French revolutions. And these revolutions sought to abolish governments that were oppressive and install new regimes that were more aligned with the principles of democracy and self-determination and human rights. A century after, in the 19th century, the steam engine was invented. And the invention of the steam engine also facilitated the invention of, a few other things like the telephone, the radio, cameras, the light bulb, very importantly. And these inventions at the time changed the way people work, drastically changed the nature of work. It simplified production more than it ever had. And most importantly, it led to an increase in mobility and the availability of goods due to the train. So goods could transport farther than they ever had at any point in time. So what this did in the European society at the time was it led to a shift from a primarily agricultural society, from an agricultural society to one that was mostly based on factory work. And of course, that led to a mass identity crisis as everyday people transitioned from being self-sufficient, subsistent farmers to becoming factory workers. And as a result, they lost their sense of autonomy. They lost their sense of connection to the land, which they deeply depended upon for their sense of identity. But most importantly, this wave of industrialization that happened in the 19th century also led to class divisions, hence Karl Marx, class divisions and alienations. And people started to feel like they were cogs in the wheel. They were picked up from their farms and forced into factory lines where they had to stay from morning till evening. And they lost a sense of autonomy. And for the first time, they actually started to question the meaning of human life. When you're in front of a factory machine, purpose is something that is very, very, very far from you. So some of the questions we answer today, like what is our purpose? What is our identity? Sprang up from the changing nature of work that started in the 19th century. And in the 20th century, specifically after the Second World War, the microwave was invented, tractors and automated machines began to replace human labor at the time, and most importantly, cars, airplanes, high-speed trains became very common modes of transportation. And what happened was the world actually started to connect. People started to move across borders, and our long-held traditional notions about cultural identity, national identity, which we held on to and went to wars for and defined us so deeply, were challenged for the first time because people realized I could up and leave and move to another country and build a life here. And I could interact with people from other societies. And international relations and international trade became a thing. And so all of these are historical proof that almost every time, one of the necessary preconditions, and that's why I described all of this, one of the necessary preconditions for a mass identity crisis is a significant shift in socio-technological realities. And that's exactly where we are now. But at no time in history has the identity question been worse than it is now. At no point has it been more difficult to grapple with the identity question. It seems like our world is shaken and the truth is struggling to be reborn, and we're at the cusp of this reawakening, and we all can feel it, and maybe that's why we're here on Saturday. We're at the cusp of a reawakening that's intended to take us back to our roots. And some of the unbearable suffering that we experience is as a result of our unwillingness or inability to deal with the identity question. But why is that the case? Why is it more difficult now than it's ever been for us to firm up identities? There's also some historical proof. Very quickly, before the Middle Ages, we derived our identity through a collective process where you as an individual, your identity was derived by the demonstration of your ties to the commonwealth. So your identity was vouched for insofar as you could prove that you belong to a commonwealth. So for example, when it happened in Western societies, but also in very many other cultures and societies, and the African society was no exception. In traditional African societies at the time, it was often asked, whose son are you? Whose daughter are you? And that was a means to validate some fundamental truth about your identity. And when you confess whose son or daughter you are, you as an individual subatom, you disappear, and the covering of the commonwealth appears and submerges your identity. So if you belong to a family with a noble reputation, it doesn't matter whether or not you are a vagabond. You're immediately submersed in the reputation of that family, and exactly the same thing vice versa. But that's not the case anymore, for sure. Things have changed drastically. Individualism is now the primary framework through which our construction of identity exists, and that's not an easy thing to do. That's a terribly difficult thing to do, because no matter who you are, identity formation is now a task that each of us has to undertake for us to navigate our way in the world. And so it seems like we each have to build our own identities individually and then weave it together for us to rebuild some sort of cultural pattern. And doing this requires us to define exactly who we want to be and be incredibly willing to let everything else fall by the wayside. So that amount of willingness is incredibly necessary for us to undertake this endeavor. So, the question of identity, as we started out discussing, how do we define our identity? Is it political? Are you your political beliefs? Is it economic? Like Karl Marx thought. He thought that there were only two identities that existed, and it's the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the oppressor and the oppressed, and that was all you needed to embrace as part of your identity. Is it racial? We don't live in a multiracial society here in Nigeria, but in multiracial societies, it's very easy and tempting for you to define your identity as your race. Is it subjective? Is it something you define for yourself and then tell other people? Is it something that your society defines for you? Are you your desires? Is that your identity? Are you the things that you want? We need to think back to these questions from first principles. When Friedrich Nietzsche, the German existentialist, declared the death of God, one of the things that he prescribed and predicted was the rise of what he called the Übermensch. And the Übermensch literally means the overman, the better man, the superman. And the overman is an archetype of the new individual who transcends predictable culture to invent their own values. So for Nietzsche, the response to the meaninglessness that ensues as a result of the erosion and the destruction of culture in society is for each of us to invent our own values. We all had to invent our own values and be transformed by the invention of those values. So his prescription for the death of God was that each of us would have to become as gods in ourselves for us to survive the death of God. But it turns out we are not very good at that. Partly because gods are meant to be worshipped. And this idea of subjective identity is incredibly problematic because the invention of subjective identity and the pursuit of that identity also necessarily entails the worship of that subjective identity. And that's a sure pathway to hell. But how did we even get so obsessed with the idea of subjective identity as a culture? I think I have an answer to that. There's something called the IKEA effect, and I stumbled on it while preparing for this lecture. There's something known as the IKEA effect, and it's an interesting psychological phenomenon that would help us answer this question of subjective identity. So the IKEA effect is named after the Swedish furniture company that sells products pre-assembled. And it's a cognitive that requires self-assembly, so not pre-assembled. It sells furniture products that require you to assemble it yourself. And it's this cognitive bias that individuals place disproportionately high value on things that we have created ourselves. because the act of putting it together ourselves imbues you as an individual with a sense of pride and meaning and, personalization of that thing that you created. Even if what you created is subpar to something that came pre-assembled, it imbues you with a sense of meaning. So we do something that's akin to worshiping it. So the principle here is, as an individual, no matter what it is, whether it's a piece of furniture or it's your identity, when you spend too much time creating something by your own self, you tend to do something that's akin to worshiping it because it feels personal to you. And maybe one of the reasons why our generation is so easily given to the lustful spirit of pride is because we continue to create and worship subjective identities, and we're unwilling to let them go even when they no longer serve us. It's a primary failing of culture when it gives us nothing to inherit. And our notion of generational inheritance is so what? Inheritance is not money. Inheritance is not cars. Inheritance is not estates. Those things are gifts, right? And inheritance, one of the best places to look to actually understand the true weight and dimension of inheritance is the Old Testament. Those people understood that inheritances are dimensions that are given to you by God, and they are passed down from generation to generation, and they are given through consecrations and covenants. So an inheritance is a tangible, moral, spiritual, and cognitive bequest that you leave with those people who will come after you. But because we have nothing, we don't exactly have any inheritance. And talking about the Old Testament, think about it. What did Abraham give to Isaac? The promise. What did Isaac give to Jacob? The blessing. What did Jacob give to Judah? The kingship. So they understood what they carried, and that when they transferred it, it meant something. And so they couldn't afford to be careless. So for our generation, we may not have inherited very much, especially by way of culture. But what are we going to leave behind? And no society makes meaningful progress in the absence of a moral and spiritual order. So maybe if we're looking to fix things, that's a good place for us to look. So let's define identity. With all of these things said, what does that mean for you? How do you define what your identity is? It's probably no straightforward enterprise, but I have a sense, and we have a sense, even from hearing us speak earlier. Your identity is the highest ideal you strive towards. It is the ultimate good that you aspire to. Your identity is your answer to the question, what way of life shall I choose and make my own? Your identity is a process of discovering and embracing who you are by taking responsibility for your choices and confronting despair. And it's an even more dynamic process of becoming your true self, with the emphasis on becoming your true self by integrating the mortal and immortal aspects of your existence through a transformative relationship with the divine. That's exactly what your identity is. And why is that important? It's important for us to figure this out because our identity is the primary source of authority we have in this world. Who are you? Who are you going to become? What ideals do you aspire towards? Your identity gives authority to your endeavors in this world. And without that, you are nothing. There's nothing productive that you're going to be able to do. So, with everything I've said so far, it's clear that the process of cultivating your identity and nurturing it, for lack of a better word, is not a straightforward process. It's not a straightforward process with a formula. It is one that only you can do for yourself. There are some results that you get that you can only acquire, by going through the journey yourself. In opposition, there are results that you acquire by relying on the efforts of others without going through the process of acquiring it yourself. For example, if I wanted to calculate the distance from the Earth to the moon, I don't need to do that myself. I just need to look in a book because an astronomer has done that work for me. But no matter how much I love you, I can't give you physical fitness. That's a result that you can only get by going through the process of acquiring it by yourself. And the kinds of truths that matter in life, like who you are, who you want to become, are much more similar to physical fitness than they are mathematical information like the distance from the earth to the moon. So your identity is one of those. No one can do that for you. No one can answer that question for you. Yes, we need culture. We need the raw materials to be present in culture and community and our families. But bringing it all together to weave the answer to the question, who am I going to be? What archetype am I going to live out in the world? Is something that only you can do for yourself. That journey to that understanding, no one else can take for you. And to take us on that journey and prescribe some steps to us very quickly, I want to introduce you to the thought of a guy called Søren Kierkegaard. He was a religious existentialist philosopher in Denmark from Denmark in the 19th century. And there's probably no single person who had more influence on religion and philosophy in the 19th century than Søren Kierkegaard. So in the last few years of his life, and he died in 1855, if I remember correctly, he entered into a battle with the State Church of Denmark. And his complaint was that being a Christian in Denmark had become a taken for granted ceremonial and cultural event, and that the church as an institution had become too comfortable, that it long abandoned authentic Christianity. And he parodied the churchgoers of Denmark at the time as bloated birds who met every Sunday to give praise to the Creator for giving them wings, but had grown too fat to fly. And at the same time, hated everyone else who used their wings just because they could not. That was the sort of person he was. He looked around the European society in the 19th century, and it seemed like everyone was hard at work trying to make things easier and easier for everyone else with new technology and new inventions. And he thought that his life's purpose was to give people what they were missing but desperately needed. And he thought that was to create difficulties everywhere. And his rationale for that was that life's greatest rewards only comes to those who are willing to voluntarily embrace difficulties and confront despair. I agree with that. The labor pains of the mother births new life. The perseverance and the exertions of an athlete brings about self-mastery and athletic success. The creative struggles of a writer brings about great novels and so on. But his goal was much larger than that. His goal was way larger than that. He thought that the more honest we became with ourselves as human beings, the more we would realize that we are insufficient in our own selves. That the more honest we became and the more we looked within ourselves, the more we would realize the insufficiency of our other attempts. And that's exactly where we find life center. That it requires a significant amount of not just self-introspection, but the realization that on our own it's impossible for us to find life's answers. And that's when we begin the journey of life. And I want to explain this just a little bit more, referencing the thoughts of Søren Kierkegaard, because I think that therein lies the answer, or at least a great answer to the question of identity. So, Kierkegaard described everyone's life's journey as going through 3 stages. So he described that there were 3 different identity stages that everyone passed through in life. Some necessarily did not make it to the top. The first of them is the aesthetic stage. The second is the ethical stage. And the third is the religious stage. So let's get into it. In the aesthetic stage, so if you're a person who lives your life and your level of identity is at the aesthetic stage, the aesthetic person lives at the level of their senses, at the level of their impulses, and at the level of their emotions. If you're an aesthetic person, your life is a continuous search for satisfying moments. And it's a broad range of personalities that fit into this category. So, and we all know people who are just hedonists, who do nothing but just wallow in base sensual pleasures. They definitely belong in this category. Romantics who do nothing but just revel in the enjoyment of art and beauty. They also belong in this category. Even the intellectual who enjoys intellectual ideas as though they're fine wine, but continues to live like a scoundrel and does nothing to implement these ideas in their own life. All of this range of personalities belong to the aesthetic stage. It's like for the aesthetic person, the only two categories that matter are boring and interesting. And their life is a never-ending quest to avoid boredom by seeking out ever new, interesting experiences. It's almost like boredom is the root of all evil for this type of person. But the aesthetic person ultimately runs into two problems. The first is a lot of experiences are transitory. So when you're seeking out pleasures and your identity and your life's purpose is to seek out new pleasures, you run out of pleasures very quickly because life's experiences are very transitory. So, maybe you're admiring a beautiful flower, but then it fades. Or, it's 7:30 a.m. and you have to leave the club and go home and actually confront the reality of your existence that you're running away from by spending your every night at the club. Or that flushing moment of intimacy with someone of the opposite sex, it goes away very quickly. And you're left with that inner feeling of emptiness, which we all know so well. That's the first problem that the aesthetic person runs into. The second problem that the aesthetic person runs into is too much of any pleasure gets really tiring. It gets stale. It gets boring after a while. So the response of this person is to start to seek out new pleasures, to seek out novelty by rotating their pleasure. So if you're in this category, maybe for you it's a new talking stage every few weeks. Or even worse, it's probably multiple new talking stages simultaneously every few weeks. And once you encounter anything that looks like commitment, it gives you the ache and you get disillusioned immediately and you run away because, it robs you of the freedom and the detachment that you need to continue to live the aesthetic life. I must warn, though, that the use of the term aesthetic here is not the way we use it in modern terms to refer to beauty and art. Its use here derives from its original Greek term, which is to sense or to perceive. And that's why we use anesthetic to describe any clinical substance that dulls our senses. It's also interesting that the Greek verb aesthetikos also has the same root words as theory and theater. So for Kierkegaard, the aesthetic person is the one who lives their life with a sense of detachment, like an uninvolved spectator in their lives. And I think we all know this. We all know someone, or maybe it's us ourselves. We all know moments where we go through life where we wallow like we're uninvolved spectators in our lives. And that is the problem with the aesthetic person. At some point, you realize that you want more out of life. And it's such an unsustainable way to live life. Everyone gets to this realization, but very few people take any action here. Most people stay this way, continue to wallow in this until they are dead. And yes, they may have breath in their nostrils, but they died a long time ago. And very few people who are courageous enough to decide that they no longer want to continue to live that way, make a leap to the next stage, which Kierkegaard calls the ethical stage. And for him, the ethical stage is about moral responsibility. It's when you start to treat yourself like, not as a bundle of impulses and a bundle of desires. You start to treat yourself like a being, a moral being with agency. And you realize that the actions that you take in the world have consequences. They have consequences on your life. They have consequences on the lives of those around you. And if you do a really good job of it, you probably stand a chance to shape the trajectory of society itself and be an active, positive participant and contributor in your generation for posterity. That's the stage where you realize that. And it's in this stage that you recognize that you have a responsibility, that your life is a project. It's a moral project, and it's your responsibility to make it coherent and purposeful. And so what do we do when we get to this stage? We start to wrestle with ourselves. We start to confront our inner chaos. We start to confront our flaws and confront our weaknesses, not to indulge them, but to gain mastery over them so we could become people who set our lives back on track and, we're in order and possibly can influence those who are around us positively. And when we embark on this journey, and this is also where the ethical stage fails and is incomplete, we confront the chaos that exists within us, but not just do we do that, we confront the chaos that's out there in the world. And we actually realize at this point that, according to Kierkegaard, that living ethically is hard. And it's almost impossible for us to undertake that task. No man can live up to his ethical ideal. And that's the problem with the ethical stage, because we are wrestling and battling against forces that are probably stronger than us. The second problem with the ethical stage and people, who try to live ethically, according to Kierkegaard, is something fundamentally still missing. So yes, you might be a very good father. You might be an incredibly competent civil servant. You might be, very gentle to your wife, and you may even be a religious worker. But something is still missing. You're still summed up by the series of universal characteristics that still clothe you, right? So you're nothing but this collection of social roles. Yes, I'm a mom. I am a wife. I am a competent civil servant. I'm a religious worker. But where is the authentic self that lies behind all of these people? So self-fulfillment for Kierkegaard is not possible in this stage. And those who recognize this make that ultimate leap. Have we ever heard of the term leap of faith? Like taking a leap of faith? So Kierkegaard came up with that term. They take the leap of faith to the third, final, and ultimate stage, which is the religious stage. And very simply, the religious stage involves the understanding that we are finite beings who are burdened by our own finitude, and that on our own, trying to live ethically, we will indubitably fail, and that as finite beings, we derive our strength and source from the reliance on something that's infinite, and for him, that's God. That's how we derive our existence. And a person like Socrates, an ethical person, might have this attitude of moral self-sufficiency and think, well, look, I am good. I don't need this. But, that's not true, because we all know this. We all know times where we struggle. We all know, when we make promises to ourselves never to do certain things, and the next day we're right back at it. And it doesn't make us fundamentally flawed people, but it means we're playing at the ethical stage, and there's one more leap that we need to make, where we completely rely on something that completely supersedes us, something that's not as finite as we are, and that's God. And a great example, because the temptation here might be to listen to this and think, oh, well, okay, I'm religious, so I think I'm good. I don't think you're good. A great example that Kierkegaard himself gave in his book was the story of Abraham, who received this, utterly incomprehensible, and I dare say morally outrageous command from God to sacrifice his son, and who very happily set off to Mount Moriah with his son to do that. And it's a paradox, because it's, Abraham's obedience and faith in God does not negate his love for his son. It also doesn't negate his moral understanding that killing an innocent child is wrong, because Isaac was very many things. Isaac was an embodiment of God's promise. Isaac was a fulfillment of his divine purpose and was the future of his lineage. But he understood that obedience to God and faith superseded reliance on rationally based universal ethics. And that's exactly the point Kierkegaard was trying to make with the religious stage, that a person who is playing at this level of identity, does not derive their moral, their relationship with the divine is not derived from their acts of morality. But the other way around, their acts of morality is derived from their relationship with the divine, and as such, can be superseded by that. And the term he used was the teleological suspension of the ethical. That moment where faith permits you to suspend ethical, rationally based ethical understanding in service of higher divine purpose. And there's also a similarity between Kierkegaard's three identity stages and Apostle John's stratification of believers in the book of 1 John. John stratified Christians, believers, people of faith into three: children, young men, and elders. And children are consumers. Children are consistently rely on the benevolence of God for their existence. So yes, they are in the will of God. They are in the will of the divine, but there's almost nothing that they can productively do for the divine because their relationship is very parasitic. They are always asking for their needs to be met in exactly the way a baby does, for their needs to be met. And when their needs are not met, they throw very many different tantrums and sometimes even threaten to leave the will. That's who children are. And many people play at this stage. So it's up to you to kind of use your tongue to count your teeth and decide if you belong in this stage. If you decide to grow up from being a child, you become a young man. And young men are strong men who are defenders of territories. They are people who fight the battle of God. They contend with spirits to bring down negative altars. That's who they are. And the testimony of a young man is not a car, it's not a house, it's not a wife. It is the battles of God that he has fought. So when you graduate from being a young man to becoming an elder becomes a custodian. An elder is not worried about what God can do for him or even what he can do for God. An elder is a custodian who almost gazes into eternity and carries about the fear of God. An elder is concerned about who he intrinsically is for God, not just about what he can do for God, and concerned about the preservation of the presence of God in the territories that they oversee. So it's up to us, do this juxtaposition and figure out, where exactly are you? Are you exactly the sort of person who, only relies on other people, on the divine for your needs to be met, and you don't think of yourself as someone who exists to meet the needs of other people, who exists with a level of responsibility or something to offer to people? Because in a lot of ways, it is through your deeds, it is through the decision to become a specific type of person that your identity is chiseled and formed. It's not formed in isolation. It's not something you do by yourself, in the confines of your bedroom. You do it out there in the world by deciding who you want to show up as. And so to round things off, there are three ways, at least three ways to grow in your identity, and I want to share some of those with you. Of course, it's very important, so when we undertake this, task of identity formation, we grow deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, till we leave this world, trying to become our authentic self, the person who we truly could become if we showed up as everything we are. Do you ever ask yourself that, who could I really be if I put my hands to the plow and, physically, spiritually, emotionally, financially, if I did everything I know I could do, who could I really be? We're probably living life on 20%, and it's impossible for any meaningful identity formation to happen at that stage. So at least three ways for us to grow in our identity. The first is consecration. Your consecration are the laws that govern your destiny. And it's very different for different people. And that's why you cannot copy other people. You can't look to other people, lest you desire by covetousness what they got by consecration. We all know people who who say anything, they do anything, they eat and drink anything. They have no boundaries. And, with them, anything goes. We don't admire those people very much. We really don't admire them because we know that a person of destiny has consecrations upon which he anchors himself like a rock. And the foundation of the reality that is our life is tied to our interaction with that eternal stone. That's what a person of destiny does. That's what a person who understands the identity and the authority that they have, that's what they do. So your consecration is your place of strength. It's where you're strong. Everywhere else, you're weak and feeble. And that's where you grow in intimacy of the knowledge of yourself and the depth of that knowledge that allows you go out into the world and conquer. The second thing, very quickly, is sacrifice. And it's something I talk about very often. But there are things we have to be willing to let go of. For example, you have to be willing to sacrifice the present for the future. And sacrifice as a principle is one of the most lethal weapons for the amassing of authority and for identity formation. And the third thing is you have to confess what you believe. You have to confess what you believe. There is a special place in the future for those who are willing to put their hands above the parapet and say what they believe. Because through your words, you craft reality. Through your words, you shape destiny, because in the beginning was the word, and it's the primary constituent element for the extraction of light from darkness. That's exactly what it is. And so if we did these three things, and if we apply them, and we found ways to bake them into how we lived our life, to bake them into how we showed up in our interactions, we will become people of stronger identity. And I debated, whether or not while I was, backstage to talk about this, but I'm going to do very, very briefly. Because we're custodians of the future. Honestly, to be frank with you, in very many ways, I'm probably even more concerned about the next generation than I'm concerned about you people. Many of us here, I'm concerned about how we set them up for success. And that's something that we have to take very importantly. Some of us here are parents, almost everyone here is a parent in waiting. So that's important. So how do we set the future generation up properly? So maybe they have something to inherit, and this is very practical. It boils down to how we raise children. It boils down to how we raise children. And I'm also going to say three things on this. The first is we have to be willing to introduce deprivation early. And it's a bit of a conundrum because where adults are having children much later in life now, by historical standards, children are being born to adults who are old enough to be grandparents by historical standards. But also, adults are having fewer children, when compared to historical standards. So we're having fewer children later. And as a result, it's so tempting to be sheltering and to be protective of children. And also because we're having children a lot later in life, you've been able to amass resources that can allow you give anything you want to these children, or to this child who you've had. But it's a paradox because if you've worked so hard to be able to give your kids a life that you probably did not have and you want them to have, and you want to give them comfort, the question is how much comfort is enough comfort? Because all the literature is clear on this one. A healthy amount of deprivation introduced early is necessary to prime the potential and instincts of young people, for them to go out into the world, for them to confront despair, for them to solve problems. And it starts with solving simple problems at home, solving problems on the playground and in school. So we need to introduce intentionally a healthy amount of deprivation. Do not steal from the future of your children by doing for them things that they can do for themselves. It's a bad principle. We're setting children up for failure, and it harms the identity formation efforts in the long term. The second thing I would say is we have to surround children with other children. We have to surround children with other children. And, this might mean maybe having more children so they have siblings who can, pound out that tendency for narcissism and self-absorption, because one thing other children hate is children who are self-absorbed and narcissistic. And part of that probably also means much less screen time for children. If you're an adult and you have guests coming to, come visit you, maybe with their kids, one of the very tempting things to do is to, just put all of them in front of a television so they don't disturb the adults and you can have a meaningful conversation. And that completely makes sense. But it's wrong. It's wrong. What you probably should do instead is, toss all of them into a room where they are bored and frustrated enough that they can come up with their own entertainment. They can invent their own entertainment. But it's not just entertainment. What happens when they do that is they learn the primary rules of socialization. You're socializing your children properly, especially very early in life. They learn how to deal with other children. They learn the rules of engagement. And the solution to this is not to regulate or censor what they watch on TV. It's about what they are not doing when they are spending time on their screens and the detrimental effect that has on their growth. So, for example, you cannot get a violent child to become non-violent by getting him. And it's always boys, because boys are more disagreeable than girls and so tend to be more violent. You cannot get a child who is violent to be less violent by getting him to watch non-violent TV. Right? But you can get him to be less violent by exposing him to other children, by having him learn the rules of engagement with other kids at the playground. And the reason why this is important is it allows them socialize with other people. It allows them build an identity in relation to other kids. And there's psychological literature that past the age of 4, it's going to be terribly difficult for any child to do so. Nearly impossible for any child to do so. So a lot of the identity questions, the identity crisis, we don't exactly know who we are. A lot of it can be traced to childhood, socialization problems. And the final thing I'm going to say on this is we need more masculine attention. We need more masculine attention. There's a gross shortage of males in roles that enable the masculine socialization of children early on. Partly because men are likelier to abandon their children than women are, but more so, in cases of divorce, women are likelier to be given custody of children. And I'm not complaining about that. But this is even made worse because we have less and less male primary school teachers. And here's why this is important. It's important because mothers have higher levels of threat sensitivity and are much likelier to be protective and to prioritize safety. And that's necessary, especially when children are infants. But that likelihood for protection, it robs the children of the sort of socialization, the sort of father pattern socialization that may seem risky in the short term, but has long-term consequences on identity formation in the social world. And that's why we need both parents. So we need to demand of men to step up. And when men step up, we need to allow them to. So enough of the accusations of toxic masculinity. It doesn't help men. It doesn't help women. It especially doesn't help children. Because children who grow up without masculine attention, without fathers, it's catastrophic for them. We damage them, and when we release them into society, then they start to do things like playing with their identities in precisely the manner in which a young child who doesn't understand their place in the social world will, because they don't know who they are, and they weren't told so from a very early age. So we need to pay a lot of attention to how we raise children. We need to do so because they are the custodians of the future. They, in many ways, are the fulfillment of our own divine purpose. They are the next generation for whom we strive to make things better and better. And in many ways, they give meaning to our lives. Not necessarily your children, but the collective class of children who will come after us. So, to close this talk on identity, we're moral beings with agency, and our lives are moral projects. It's up to us to decide what we are going to do with those. No one can take that journey for us. And if we don't do so, we stand the risk of repeating the exact same mistakes that unknowingly to them the generation of our parents made. But we can't make that excuse anymore because we know now. We know, we have enough information. We know that it's up to us to decide who we are going to be. And so we are going to make that choice. We're going to make that choice by committing ourselves to the highest ideal, by setting up an ethical ideal for us, by striving towards the divine, and by joining our faith with those of the, with the faith of those around us, and deciding that the way we've lived our lives before, we don't necessarily have to continue to live that way. And for us to round off, I have a declaration that I want us to say together. Please repeat after me. I'm a custodian of the future. I recognize the authority I carry, and I walk in the fullness of that authority. I use my words carefully. I say what I mean, and I mean what I say. I strive to grow in spirit and in truth, that the world I leave behind may be better than the one I met. So help me God. Thank you.